Every great film begins long before the first camera rolls, and Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is no exception. Although audiences first learned about the project through an official announcement in late 2024, the origins of the film stretch back much further. For decades, Nolan had expressed an interest in stories that explore memory, identity, time, destiny, and the limits of human understanding. Homer's The Odyssey, one of the oldest surviving works of literature, contains all of these themes in remarkable abundance. Rather than simply being an adventure about monsters and gods, the ancient epic is fundamentally a story about survival, perseverance, family, temptation, and the psychological cost of war. These ideas closely align with the themes that have appeared throughout Nolan's filmography, making the project feel less like an unexpected choice and more like the culmination of artistic interests that had been developing throughout his entire career. Following the enormous commercial and critical success of Oppenheimer, Nolan found himself in an unusual position within Hollywood. Very few directors possess enough creative freedom to secure massive budgets while maintaining complete artistic control. The worldwide success of Oppenheimer strengthened his relationship with Universal Pictures, giving both the studio and the filmmaker confidence to pursue another ambitious production. Instead of choosing another historical drama or an original science fiction concept, Nolan turned his attention toward one of the oldest stories ever told. The source material itself is legendary. Written nearly 3,000 years ago and traditionally attributed to the ancient Greek poet Homer, The Odyssey has influenced literature, theater, philosophy, cinema, and storytelling across countless generations. The epic follows Odysseus, the King of Ithaca, during his 10-year journey home after the Trojan War. Along the way, he encounters mythical creatures, powerful gods, dangerous temptations, and impossible moral choices while his family struggles to survive in his absence. Although countless adaptations of the story have appeared over the centuries, very few filmmakers have attempted to present the complete journey with modern cinematic technology and blockbuster scale. One of the earliest creative decisions Nolan reportedly made was determining exactly which version of the ancient text would serve as the screenplay's primary foundation. Instead of attempting to combine dozens of translations or relying entirely on secondary interpretations, Nolan based his screenplay primarily on Emily Wilson's acclaimed 2017 English translation of Homer's epic. That translation became famous for presenting the ancient story with remarkable clarity, accessibility, and emotional precision while avoiding overly ornate or outdated language. This approach allowed Nolan to study the narrative in a way that emphasized the humanity of its characters rather than treating them as distant mythological figures. Choosing a single translation may seem like a relatively small decision, but it actually shaped nearly every aspect of the screenplay. Different translations of the Odyssey often portray characters, dialogue, motivations, and even emotional tone in significantly different ways. Some emphasize grand heroism, while others highlight vulnerability or moral ambiguity. Wilson's version presents Odysseus as an exceptionally intelligent but deeply flawed man whose decisions frequently carried devastating consequences. This interpretation aligns closely with Nolan's long-standing fascination with imperfect protagonists. Throughout films such as Memento, The Prestige, Inception, Interstellar, Dunkirk, and Oppenheimer, Nolan has consistently focused on brilliant individuals whose strengths are inseparable from their weaknesses. Rather than creating a literal page-by-page cinematic translation of the poem, Nolan adapted the material into a screenplay designed specifically for modern filmmaking. Ancient epic poetry functions very differently from contemporary cinema. The original poem often repeats descriptions, revisits earlier events through storytelling, shifts perspectives between gods and humans, and spends considerable time reflecting on themes through speeches rather than action. While these techniques work beautifully in oral storytelling traditions, they require significant restructuring when adapted into a feature film. The screenplay, therefore, involved balancing respect for Homer's original narrative with the pacing expectations of 21st century audiences. Rather than removing the complexity of the source material, Nolan reorganized its structure to maximize emotional momentum. The result preserves the central journey while streamlining certain narrative passages, expanding others, and carefully deciding where visual storytelling could replace lengthy exposition. Another important question during development involved deciding how mythology itself should be presented. The Odyssey includes Cyclopes, Sirens, witches, sea monsters, divine interventions, magical transformations, and journeys into the underworld. Earlier adaptations often leaned toward fantasy spectacle, emphasizing magical effects above emotional realism. Nolan approached these elements differently. Reports throughout production consistently suggested that he sought to ground even the most fantastical events within a believable physical reality, instead of asking audiences to simply accept impossible events. His approach encouraged viewers to experience mythology through the psychological perspective of the characters. This creative philosophy reflects Nolan's previous work. In Inception, dream worlds obey internally consistent rules. In Interstellar, speculative science is presented with extraordinary technical detail. Even films involving extraordinary concepts remain emotionally anchored in realistic human experiences. Applying this philosophy to Greek mythology represented one of the screenplay's greatest creative challenges. Development also involved determining the appropriate narrative scale. Homer's original poem spans years of travel across enormous distances, while introducing dozens of important characters and locations. Compressing such an expansive story into a single feature-length film required difficult decisions regarding pacing and emphasis. Every adaptation inevitably leaves out material, but successful adaptations ensure that the emotional core remains intact. When Christopher Nolan announced that his next film would be an adaptation of the Odyssey, many audiences were initially surprised. Throughout his career, Nolan had become synonymous with original high-concept science fiction, psychological thrillers, historical dramas, and complex narratives built around time, memory, and perception. A mythological epic based on an ancient Greek poem seemed like an unexpected departure from that body of work. However, upon closer examination, the project fits remarkably well within the larger themes that have defined Nolan's career for more than 25 years. Rather than representing a dramatic change in artistic direction, the Odyssey can be viewed as the natural evolution of ideas that Nolan has explored since his earliest films. At the heart of Nolan's filmmaking philosophy is the belief that spectacle should always serve character rather than replace it. Although his films frequently feature enormous visual set pieces, massive practical effects, and groundbreaking technical achievements, those moments are almost always rooted in emotional storytelling. Whether it is the collapsing dream cities in Inception, the rotating hallway fight, the wormhole journey in Interstellar, the atomic explosion in Oppenheimer, or the aerial combat of Dunkirk, the visual spectacle exists to deepen the audience's understanding of the characters rather than simply impress them. This same philosophy shaped every aspect of the Odyssey. Instead of treating Homer's poem as a fantasy adventure filled with monsters and magical creatures, Nolan approached it primarily as the story of one man attempting to find his way home after enduring unimaginable trauma. In many ways, the legendary creatures become external representations of Odysseus' internal struggles. The journey is not simply geographical. It is psychological. Every island, every temptation, every divine punishment, and every obstacle reflects a different aspect of his emotional state. This interpretation transforms an ancient myth into something deeply human and immediately relatable for modern audiences. One of Nolan's defining characteristics as a filmmaker has always been his refusal to underestimate the audience. Many blockbuster films simplify complicated ideas in order to ensure accessibility, but Nolan consistently assumes viewers are willing to think actively while watching his films. He trusts audiences to assemble information themselves, to recognize patterns, and to interpret symbolism without excessive explanation. This respect for audience intelligence became especially important in adapting the Odyssey. The original poem contains numerous layers of meaning. On one level, it is an adventure story. On another, it is a meditation on leadership, loyalty, mortality, family, pride, and destiny. Nolan resisted the temptation to reduce these themes into simple moral lessons. Instead, he constructed the film so that different viewers could discover different meanings depending on their own perspectives. Some audiences may focus on the action and mythological encounters, while others become more invested in the emotional relationship between Odysseus and Penelope, or the coming-of-age story of Telemachus, or the tension between free will and divine intervention. Another defining aspect of Nolan's artistic philosophy is his fascination with time. Few filmmakers have explored the concept as extensively. Memento unfolds backwards. The Prestige plays with memory and repetition. Inception layers multiple timelines simultaneously. Dunkirk presents 3 separate time frames occurring concurrently. Tenet literally reverses temporal direction. Oppenheimer shifts between subjective and objective perspectives across different historical periods. Although the Odyssey does not involve science fiction concepts like time travel, its narrative naturally aligns with Nolan's interest in nonlinear storytelling. Homer's original epic itself is not presented chronologically. The poem begins after Odysseus has already been missing for years, introduces his family before showing his adventures, and reveals much of his journey through extended flashbacks told by Odysseus himself. Rather than imposing a modern linear structure upon the story, Nolan embraced the sophisticated narrative design that Homer had already created thousands of years earlier. This allowed Nolan to demonstrate something he has often argued throughout his career. Complex storytelling is not inherently modern. Ancient literature frequently experimented with narrative techniques that contemporary audiences often consider innovative. By preserving much of the poem's structural complexity, Nolan honored both classical storytelling traditions and modern cinematic language simultaneously. Visual realism has always been another cornerstone of Nolan's filmmaking philosophy. Despite working with increasingly ambitious concepts, he consistently favors photographing real environments whenever possible. He often avoids digital sets, excessive green screens, and computer-generated imagery unless absolutely necessary. Instead, he seeks locations that provide genuine physical scale. This philosophy influenced the Odyssey from its earliest planning stages. Rather than constructing every mythical location inside sound stages surrounded by visual effects, Nolan reportedly pursued extensive location shooting across rugged coastlines, mountains, caves, and islands that could provide authentic textures impossible to recreate digitally. His goal was not historical perfection, but physical credibility. Even when audiences encounter supernatural events, those moments occur within landscapes that feel genuinely ancient and tangible. The decision to film using IMAX cameras also reflects Nolan's artistic priorities. Throughout his career, he has consistently championed large-format photography because he believes it allows viewers to experience environments with greater immersion and emotional intensity. The Odyssey's vast oceans, towering cliffs, storm-filled skies, and monumental architecture become more than beautiful scenery. They emphasize humanity's relative smallness within a world governed by forces beyond individual control. Nolan has frequently spoken about cinema as an experience best shared collectively inside theaters. Unlike many contemporary directors who prioritize streaming platforms or smaller screens, he believes film should be designed around immersive theatrical presentation. This philosophy affected the Odyssey in multiple ways. Scenes were reportedly designed with visual scale in mind rather than relying primarily on dialogue. Long sequences allow audiences to absorb landscapes, architecture, weather, and movement through carefully composed images. Nolan often avoids rapid editing, preferring compositions that encourage viewers to explore the frame themselves. This slower visual rhythm complements the epic nature of Homer's journey, while distinguishing the film from faster-paced contemporary fantasy blockbusters. Another hallmark of Nolan's directing style is his emphasis on practical filmmaking whenever possible. Throughout his career, he has become famous for building rotating hallways instead of relying entirely on digital effects, crashing actual airplanes, constructing enormous sets, and performing dangerous stunts in real environments. This commitment creates a tactile realism that audiences often perceive subconsciously. Applying this philosophy to the Odyssey presented unique challenges because much of the source material involves impossible events. Rather than replacing practical filmmaking with computer-generated imagery, Nolan reportedly sought hybrid solutions. Large ships were physically constructed. Coastal villages were built on location. Storm sequences combined practical water effects with digital enhancement. Creature encounters emphasize performer interaction before adding visual effects. By grounding extraordinary events within real, physical environments, Nolan preserved emotional authenticity even during the story's most fantastical moments. His directing philosophy also emphasizes collaboration over domination. Although Nolan is known for maintaining a clear artistic vision, many of his long-term collaborators describe his productions as highly organized environments where every department understands the broader creative goals. Cinematographer, production designers, costume designers, composers, editors, and actors all contribute to a unified vision rather than competing artistic directions. This consistency has become one of Nolan's greatest strengths. Audiences often recognize a Nolan film not because of recurring visual tricks, but because every creative element appears to support the same emotional and thematic objectives. Music reinforces narrative structure. Editing reflects psychological experience. Costume design expresses character evolution. Production design mirrors thematic ideas. Every department contributes to the same storytelling language. Character psychology remains central to Nolan's artistic approach. Although critics occasionally argue that his films prioritize ideas over emotion, his protagonists consistently face deeply personal dilemmas. Leonard Shelby searches for meaning despite memory loss. Bruce Wayne struggles with fear and responsibility. Cobb longs to reunite with his children. Cooper sacrifices decades with his family to preserve humanity. Oppenheimer confronts the moral consequences of scientific achievement. Odysseus joins this tradition naturally. Nolan's interpretation reportedly focuses not simply on heroic achievement, but on psychological endurance. Years of war, followed by years of wandering, have fundamentally changed the man attempting to return home. The central dramatic question, therefore, becomes more profound than whether Odysseus can reach Ithaca. The deeper question is whether he remains the same person who originally departed. Can someone survive unimaginable hardship without losing their identity? This question echoes throughout nearly all of Nolan's previous films. Another recurring feature of Nolan's directing style is moral ambiguity. He rarely divides characters into simple heroes and villains. Instead, individuals make difficult choices within impossible circumstances. Their decisions often produce unintended consequences that blur traditional distinctions between right and wrong. The Odyssey provides fertile ground for this approach. Odysseus is undeniably courageous and intelligent, yet many of his own mistakes prolong his suffering. His pride after defeating the Cyclops triggers Poseidon's relentless vengeance. His curiosity repeatedly places companions in danger. His determination inspires loyalty, but sometimes borders on obsession. Nolan reportedly resisted portraying him as either flawless hero or tragic victim. Instead, he presents Odysseus as a remarkably capable human being whose greatest strengths repeatedly create his greatest weaknesses. Nolan has also long been fascinated by the relationship between myth and reality. Batman Begins examines how symbols inspire belief beyond individual people. The Prestige explores how illusion shapes perception. Inception questions whether subjective experience defines reality. Oppenheimer portrays a historical figure whose legacy became almost mythological. The Odyssey allowed Nolan to examine mythology directly rather than metaphorically. Instead of asking whether myths are literally true, he investigates why they endure. Stories survive across thousands of years because they express emotional truths that remain relevant regardless of historical period. The monsters may be fictional, but fear is real. Divine punishment may be symbolic, but guilt is real. Magical temptation may be imaginary, but the human desire to escape responsibility remains timeless. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Nolan's vision was his determination to balance intimacy with grandeur. The Odyssey contains battles, monsters, gods, storms, kingdoms, and legendary adventures, yet its emotional core remains surprisingly simple. It is the story of a husband trying to return to his wife, a father hoping to see his son, and a family struggling to remain faithful despite overwhelming uncertainty. Rather than allowing the spectacle to overshadow these relationships, Nolan reportedly structured every major sequence around emotional stakes. Every victory matters because it brings Odysseus closer to home. Every setback matters because it prolongs his family's suffering. Every temptation matters because it threatens the promise that has sustained him throughout his journey. One of the greatest challenges facing any adaptation of the Odyssey is the task of transforming an ancient poem into a believable cinematic world. Homer's epic was created in an oral storytelling tradition nearly 3,000 years ago, in a period where myth, religion, history, and imagination existed side by side rather than as separate categories. Gods interacted directly with humans, monsters occupied distant lands, and the sea represented not merely geography, but mystery, danger, and fate itself. For a modern filmmaker, especially one as grounded and detail-oriented as Christopher Nolan, the question was not simply how to show this world visually, but how to make audiences believe in it emotionally and intellectually. World-building in cinema is often associated with fantasy and science fiction, but the most successful fictional worlds are not defined by visual spectacle alone. They're defined by consistency, atmosphere, culture, rules, and the feeling that life exists beyond the edges of the screen. Christopher Nolan approached the Odyssey not as a fantasy universe filled with random magical events, but as a coherent world governed by its own history, traditions, beliefs, and consequences. Every location, every costume, every ship, every temple, and every environmental detail contributes to the sense that this is a real civilization shaped by both human actions and divine forces. The setting of the Odyssey is the Mediterranean world during the Late Bronze Age, a period associated with powerful kingdoms, maritime trade, warrior cultures, and early forms of organized political life. Although historians continue to debate the precise historical inspirations behind Homer's stories, there is broad agreement that the epic reflects memories and cultural ideas from an ancient era that existed long before classical Greece. Nolan and his production team reportedly embraced this historical foundation while allowing space for mythological imagination. Rather than presenting the world as a generic fantasy setting, the film grounds itself in recognizable geography. Rocky coastlines, vast seas, islands, mountains, caves, forests, and ancient settlements all create a sense of physical reality. The Mediterranean becomes more than a backdrop. It becomes one of the film's most important characters. The sea in the Odyssey is not simply water separating destinations. It represents uncertainty, fate, isolation, temptation, and survival. Odysseus spends years crossing an environment that is simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Calm waters can become violent storms without warning. Unknown islands may contain hospitality or death. Every journey involves risk. Nolan reportedly emphasized these qualities by filming in real coastal environments whenever possible, using practical photography to capture the scale and unpredictability of the natural world. Environmental storytelling plays a crucial role in establishing the film's atmosphere. Great world building often communicates information without explicit dialogue. The condition of buildings, the appearance of landscapes, and the design of everyday objects all reveal important details about society. Ithaca, Odysseus' homeland, reflects order, memory, and belonging. Although modest compared to larger kingdoms, it carries emotional significance because it represents home. Its architecture, colors, and natural surroundings convey familiarity and stability. However, during Odysseus' absence, the kingdom begins to change. The presence of rival suitors, political uncertainty, and social decline gradually alter the environment. Audiences can observe these transformations visually before characters discuss them directly. In contrast, the many islands visited by Odysseus each possess distinct identities that reflect their narrative purposes. The island of the Cyclops appears harsh, isolated, and primitive, emphasizing danger and unpredictability. Circe's domain combines beauty with unease, creating a place that feels seductive yet unsettling. The land of the Sirens presents an atmosphere where desire and destruction coexist. Calypso's island offers comfort, peace, and apparent perfection, yet its tranquility masks a subtle form of imprisonment. These environments function symbolically as well as physically. Each location reflects a different emotional or psychological challenge faced by Odysseus. The world, therefore, becomes an extension of character development rather than merely a sequence of destinations. One of the most interesting aspects of the Odyssey's world-building involves its treatment of mythology. Many fantasy films establish complex systems of magic with detailed rules and explanations. Nolan approached mythology differently. The gods, creatures, and supernatural events are not presented as scientific systems, but as forces embedded within the cultural understanding of the characters. For ancient people, divine influence was not unusual or extraordinary. Storms, harvests, victories, disasters, and personal fortunes were often interpreted through religious belief. The film reportedly preserves this perspective by showing a world where humans genuinely experience life as part of a larger cosmic order. This does not mean that every supernatural event receives explicit explanation. Nolan has often preferred ambiguity in his films, allowing audiences to interpret events from multiple perspectives. Some viewers may experience the gods as literal beings, while others may understand them symbolically, as representations of fate, emotion, memory, or consequence. This flexibility allows the film to respect ancient mythology while remaining accessible to modern audiences with diverse beliefs. The rules of the universe emerge naturally through storytelling rather than lengthy exposition. One of the strengths of effective world-building is that audiences learn by observing rather than by receiving information directly. Over time, viewers understand that hospitality is sacred, pride carries consequences, promises matter, and disrespect toward divine powers can lead to suffering. These rules are not arbitrary. They reflect the moral and cultural values of the society portrayed in the film. Ancient Greek culture placed enormous importance on concepts such as honor, loyalty, reputation, family duty, and proper treatment of guests. Violating these principles often carried severe consequences in mythology and literature. The film incorporates these values into the world itself, ensuring that actions have meaningful consequences. Another important element of world building involves political structure. The Odyssey takes place in a world of kings, nobles, warriors, and alliances. Unlike modern nation-states, these societies are smaller and more personal. Leadership depends not only on laws, but on reputation, loyalty, and strength. Odysseus' absence creates a political vacuum in Ithaca. The suitors who occupy his home are not merely romantic rivals. They represent threats to social order. Their behavior disrupts traditions, consumes resources, and undermines established authority. This political instability increases narrative tension while reinforcing the importance of Odysseus' return. Family relationships also shape the world. Ancient societies often organized identity around kinship and inheritance. Telemachus' struggle to establish himself as Odysseus' son reflects broader social expectations regarding adulthood, responsibility, and leadership. Penelope's position demonstrates the limited but significant forms of influence available to women within aristocratic households. Costume design contributes significantly to environmental storytelling. Clothing reflects status, identity, profession, region, and cultural values. Warriors wear armor that communicates both practical function and symbolic prestige. Nobles display wealth through materials and decoration. Travelers appear worn by hardship. Priests, rulers, servants, and sailors all possess distinct visual identities. Unlike many fantasy productions that create entirely invented fashions, the Odyssey reportedly draws inspiration from archaeological discoveries, ancient art, and historical research. This grounding in real history helps make even mythological settings feel credible. Architecture plays an equally important role. Palaces, temples, villages, caves, and fortifications reveal differences in culture and environment. Human settlements appear shaped by geography rather than existing independently from it. Coastal communities reflect maritime life. Mountain regions emphasize isolation. Sacred spaces create connections between human and divine realms. Nolan's long-standing preference for practical sets likely strengthened these environments. Actors interacting with real structures often create more convincing performances because they inhabit physical spaces rather than imagining them. Audiences also respond differently to genuine textures, light, and scale. The film's use of natural landscapes reflects another key aspect of world building: environmental realism. Ancient people lived much closer to nature than modern societies. Weather, seasons, terrain, and geography directly influenced daily survival. Storms could destroy fleets. Harvest failures could create famine. Mountains could isolate communities. The sea could provide wealth or death. By emphasizing these realities, the film creates a world where human beings remain vulnerable. This vulnerability enhances dramatic tension because success is never guaranteed. Odysseus survives not because he controls nature, but because he adapts to it. The relationship between humans and gods further shapes the setting. Divine influence appears woven into everyday existence rather than existing separately from ordinary life. Rituals, prayers, sacrifices, and sacred traditions remind audiences that characters understand themselves as participants within a larger cosmic order. This worldview differs significantly from modern perspectives, making it one of the film's most fascinating cultural dimensions. Rather than judging ancient beliefs through contemporary assumptions, the film invites audiences to experience reality from the perspective of those who lived within these traditions. Sound design also contributes to world building. The crashing of waves, creaking ships, distant storms, wind through stone corridors, animal calls, and ritual music create an immersive sensory experience. Sound often communicates atmosphere more subtly than visual effects. Music likely plays a particularly important role. Ancient cultures used music in ceremonies, storytelling, warfare, and communal life. A modern score inspired by these traditions can create emotional connections between contemporary audiences and distant historical settings. One of the most impressive aspects of the Odyssey's world-building is its balance between realism and myth. Some adaptations choose complete historical accuracy, removing supernatural elements. Others embrace fantasy without concern for cultural authenticity. Nolan sought a middle path. His world feels ancient yet accessible, mythological yet believable, grand yet intimate. Audiences encounter gods and monsters within landscapes that feel physically real. They experience extraordinary events through the eyes of characters whose emotions remain recognizably human. This balance allows the film to explore timeless themes. Home, identity, loyalty, memory, temptation, and perseverance are not confined to one culture or historical period. They remain relevant because they reflect fundamental aspects of human experience. Perhaps the greatest achievement of the film's world-building is that it transforms geography into meaning. Every location changes Odysseus in some way. Every island teaches a lesson. Every encounter reveals something about character. The journey across the Mediterranean becomes a journey through fear, hope, grief, desire, pride, love, and endurance. One of the most fascinating aspects of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is that it cannot be easily placed into a single cinematic genre. Modern audiences often expect films to fit comfortably into recognizable categories such as action, fantasy, drama, historical epic, adventure, or psychological thriller. Nolan's adaptation deliberately resists that simplicity. Instead, it combines multiple genres into a single narrative that constantly shifts in tone and perspective while maintaining thematic consistency. This blending of genres has become one of Nolan's defining characteristics as a filmmaker, and The Odyssey represents perhaps his most ambitious exploration of genre conventions to date. At first glance, the film appears to be a fantasy epic. It contains gods, monsters, witches, mythical islands, supernatural creatures, magical events, and legendary heroes. These elements immediately place it alongside many fantasy films that have dominated modern cinema over the past several decades. However, unlike traditional fantasy stories that focus primarily on imaginary worlds disconnected from historical reality, The Odyssey grounds its fantasy within an ancient civilization that feels authentic, lived in, and culturally recognizable. Rather than inviting audiences into a completely invented universe, the film presents a version of the Bronze Age Mediterranean where mythology exists naturally within everyday life. The supernatural does not replace reality. Instead, it becomes part of how reality is understood by the people living within that world. This subtle distinction separates Nolan's adaptation from many contemporary fantasy blockbusters. Fantasy usually emphasizes limitless imagination, magical systems, and extraordinary abilities. Nolan approaches fantasy with considerably more restraint. The gods rarely exist simply to create spectacle. Every supernatural encounter has emotional, symbolic, or philosophical significance. The Cyclops is not merely a giant monster to defeat. He becomes an embodiment of pride, violence, and the consequences of arrogance. The Sirens are not simply magical singers. They represent temptation and the danger of abandoning one's purpose. Calypso is not merely an immortal goddess. She symbolizes the seductive comfort of forgetting responsibility. This symbolic treatment allows the fantasy elements to function on multiple levels simultaneously. Casual viewers experience thrilling adventures, while more attentive audiences recognize deeper psychological meanings hidden beneath the mythical imagery. The film also belongs strongly to the adventure genre. Adventure stories traditionally involve dangerous journeys, exploration of unfamiliar territories, encounters with unpredictable obstacles, and the constant movement from one location to another. The Odyssey arguably helped establish many of these conventions thousands of years before modern adventure fiction even existed. Nearly every chapter of Odysseus' journey introduces a new environment with its own dangers, cultures, and challenges. This structure creates continual momentum because audiences never know exactly what awaits beyond the next horizon. Every island becomes a new chapter, each with its own atmosphere, conflicts, and moral questions. Unlike many adventure films where exploration itself serves as the primary goal, The Odyssey always maintains a clear emotional destination. Odysseus does not seek treasure, conquest, or discovery. He seeks home. This simple objective gives remarkable emotional weight to every adventure because each success or failure directly affects his chances of reuniting with his family. Another major genre present throughout the film is historical epic. Although the supernatural elements prevent the story from functioning as strict historical fiction, Nolan reportedly incorporates extensive historical research into architecture, clothing, weapons, political organization, maritime technology, and social customs. This grounding in historical authenticity creates a convincing foundation upon which mythology can exist. Historically inspired epics often emphasize large-scale conflicts, political struggles, leadership, and civilization itself. The Odyssey includes all of these elements. The aftermath of the Trojan War shapes the entire narrative. Kingdoms struggle with succession, loyalty, and stability. Honor determines reputation. Hospitality carries legal and religious importance. Leadership is constantly tested. Rather than presenting history as distant or abstract, Nolan uses historical detail to make ancient people feel remarkably familiar. Their concerns about family, survival, legacy, and responsibility remain understandable despite the vast cultural differences separating them from modern audiences. The film also functions as a psychological drama, perhaps more than many viewers initially expect. Christopher Nolan has consistently explored characters confronting internal conflicts alongside external challenges. In the Odyssey, nearly every physical obstacle reflects an emotional struggle occurring within Odysseus himself. Psychological drama focuses less on external action than on character transformation. The central question becomes not whether the protagonist can overcome enemies, but whether they can overcome themselves. Throughout the journey, Odysseus repeatedly confronts guilt, grief, loneliness, exhaustion, pride, fear, temptation, and uncertainty. The monsters become physical expressions of emotional conflicts already existing within him. This approach transforms what could have been a straightforward adventure into an examination of trauma and endurance. Years of warfare followed by years of wandering inevitably leave psychological scars. Nolan reportedly emphasizes these consequences rather than portraying Odysseus as an invincible mythical hero. He is intelligent, courageous, and resourceful, but also deeply flawed and emotionally burdened. This psychological emphasis connects the Odyssey with many of Nolan's previous protagonists. Leonard Shelby in Memento struggles with memory. Bruce Wayne battles fear and responsibility. Cobb confronts guilt. Cooper faces impossible sacrifice. Oppenheimer wrestles with moral consequences. Odysseus joins this tradition as another extraordinary individual forced to confront profound internal challenges. The opening sequence of a film is one of its most important storytelling tools. Within the first 10 to 15 minutes, filmmakers must capture the audience's attention, establish the tone, introduce the central conflict, communicate the style of the film, and create enough emotional investment that viewers want to continue the journey. Christopher Nolan has always placed enormous importance on opening scenes. Whether it is the fragmented mystery of Memento, the bank robbery in The Dark Knight, the dream extraction in Inception, the evacuation of Dunkirk, or the hearing room in Oppenheimer, his films begin by asking questions rather than providing answers. Instead of explaining everything immediately, Nolan invites audiences into a mystery that gradually reveals itself over the course of the story. The opening of the Odyssey follows this same philosophy. Rather than beginning with a lengthy explanation of Greek mythology or a chronological retelling of the Trojan War, Nolan reportedly trusts viewers to enter the story at a moment of uncertainty. This decision closely reflects Homer's original poem, which famously begins in the middle of the larger narrative rather than at the beginning. Ancient scholars referred to this technique as in medias res, meaning into the middle of things. Instead of watching the complete sequence of events unfold from start to finish, audiences are immediately placed inside an ongoing crisis. This narrative choice accomplishes several important objectives. First, it creates curiosity. Viewers naturally begin asking questions. Who is Odysseus? Why has he disappeared? What happened during the Trojan War? Why has he not returned home? These unanswered questions encourage active engagement rather than passive observation. Second, beginning in the middle of the story immediately communicates that this will not be a conventional adventure film. Nolan avoids extensive exposition because he believes audiences enjoy assembling information themselves. Every conversation, visual detail, and character interaction gradually fills in pieces of the larger narrative without interrupting dramatic momentum. One of the earliest achievements of the opening sequence is establishing atmosphere. Before audiences fully understand the plot, they understand the emotional world they have entered. The film does not present ancient Greece as a colorful fantasy filled with constant excitement and magical wonder. Instead, the atmosphere is one of absence, uncertainty, and quiet sorrow. The Kingdom of Ithaca feels incomplete. Although daily life continues, there's an unmistakable sense that something essential has been lost. The physical environment reflects this emotional condition. Stone buildings show signs of neglect. The palace no longer possesses the vitality expected of a royal household. Servants continue their duties, yet unease permeates every interaction. Even moments of normal routine feel overshadowed by years of waiting. Christopher Nolan has frequently used environments to communicate emotional states without dialogue. In Inception, dreams shift according to subconscious emotions. In Interstellar, the dying farmland reflects humanity's fading future. In Oppenheimer, laboratories, deserts, and hearing rooms become expressions of psychological pressure. Similarly, Ithaca itself becomes a visual representation of loss. The opening also introduces Penelope, whose role immediately establishes one of the film's central emotional foundations. Rather than presenting her merely as the faithful wife waiting for her husband's return, Nolan reportedly portrays her as an active leader carrying enormous responsibility. She must preserve political stability, protect her son, manage the royal household, and navigate constant pressure from ambitious suitors seeking control of the kingdom. This characterization expands Penelope beyond traditional stereotypes. Her greatest strength is not physical combat, but extraordinary patience, intelligence, and emotional resilience. Every day requires strategic thinking. She cannot openly reject powerful nobles indefinitely, yet she refuses to abandon hope despite overwhelming uncertainty. The audience quickly understands that Penelope's struggle is every bit as difficult as Odysseus' journey across the sea. While he battles monsters and storms, she fights despair, political manipulation, and the gradual erosion of hope. Telemachus, Odysseus' son, also receives significant attention during the opening sequence. His introduction establishes another major narrative thread that will continue throughout the film. Unlike his father, Telemachus has grown into adulthood without direct parental guidance. He knows Odysseus primarily through stories, memories, and the expectations of others. This creates an identity crisis that becomes immediately apparent. The people around him constantly compare him to the legendary king he barely remembers. Some expect him to become another great warrior. Others dismiss him as inexperienced and incapable. Telemachus himself struggles to determine who he truly is beyond his father's reputation. Christopher Nolan has repeatedly explored children growing up under extraordinary circumstances. Murph in Interstellar must mature without her father. Young Bruce Wayne inherits unimaginable emotional burdens. The Odyssey extends this recurring interest through Telemachus, whose coming-of-age story parallels Odysseus' own journey home. One of the most effective elements of the opening is the introduction of the suitors. Rather than functioning as cartoonish villains, they represent a gradual collapse of social order. They occupy Odysseus' palace, consume its resources, pressure Penelope into remarriage, and increasingly treat themselves as rightful rulers. Their presence creates immediate dramatic tension because audiences recognize that time is running out. Every day Odysseus remains absent strengthens the suitor's position while weakening legitimate authority. The suitors also embody one of the film's recurring themes, the consequences of prolonged absence. Leadership cannot remain empty forever. Nature, politics, and society all resist permanent uncertainty. Visually, the contrast between Penelope and the suitors communicates this conflict without requiring extensive dialogue. Penelope preserves dignity despite exhaustion. The suitors display confidence that gradually approaches arrogance. Every memorable story is driven by conflict. Without meaningful obstacles, characters have no reason to grow, audiences have no reason to remain emotionally invested, and the narrative loses its momentum. Christopher Nolan has built his career around stories in which conflict exists on multiple levels simultaneously. His protagonists rarely face only one challenge. Instead, they struggle against external enemies, internal fears, moral dilemmas, the passage of time, and the consequences of their own decisions. The Odyssey represents perhaps the richest example of this storytelling philosophy, because Homer's original epic naturally contains several layers of conflict that interact with one another throughout the journey. What makes the Odyssey particularly compelling is that no single obstacle defines the story. Instead of presenting one central villain who can simply be defeated, the narrative constantly introduces new dangers while preserving a larger emotional objective. Odysseus may overcome one threat only to encounter another immediately afterward. Every victory creates new complications. Every solution reveals another problem. This continuous evolution of conflict prevents the story from becoming predictable and allows the audience to remain emotionally engaged throughout the entire journey. The most obvious conflict is Odysseus' struggle to return home. On its surface, this appears to be a straightforward physical objective. A king wants to return to his kingdom after the Trojan War. However, Christopher Nolan transforms this seemingly simple premise into something much more profound. Home is not merely a destination marked on a map. It represents identity, family, memory, responsibility, redemption, and hope. Every obstacle separating Odysseus from Ithaca, therefore, becomes more than a geographical challenge. It becomes an emotional test. The physical journey itself creates enormous external conflict. The Mediterranean is presented not as a peaceful body of water, but as an unpredictable force capable of destroying ships, separating companions, and altering destinies. Storms appear without warning. Navigation becomes uncertain. Supplies diminish. Every island offers new dangers hidden behind unfamiliar landscapes. Unlike many modern adventure films where travel functions primarily as a transition between action scenes, the Odyssey emphasizes the exhausting reality of prolonged wandering. Years pass. Seasons change. Friends disappear. Hope fades. Christopher Nolan reportedly places considerable emphasis on this passage of time because it reinforces the psychological weight carried by every character. Nature itself functions almost like an antagonist. The sea is indifferent to human suffering. Storms do not distinguish between heroes and ordinary sailors. Mountains, caves, forests, and isolated coastlines constantly remind audiences that human beings remain small when confronted by the natural world. This emphasis on environmental conflict has appeared throughout Nolan's previous films. In Interstellar, space itself becomes one of humanity's greatest challenges. In Dunkirk, the ocean traps thousands of soldiers between survival and defeat. In the Odyssey, the sea becomes a constant reminder that no amount of intelligence or bravery can completely eliminate uncertainty. However, the external conflicts extend far beyond nature. Odysseus faces mythological creatures whose dangers are both physical and symbolic. The Cyclops threaten survival through overwhelming strength. Circe challenges identity and self-control. The Sirens exploit emotional weakness rather than physical vulnerability. Scylla and Charybdis force impossible choices where every available option results in suffering. Each encounter introduces different forms of conflict, preventing repetition. Rather than repeatedly solving problems through combat, Odysseus must adapt his thinking. Sometimes intelligence proves more valuable than strength. Sometimes restraint becomes more important than courage. Sometimes survival requires sacrifice. This variety keeps the audience uncertain about how future conflicts will be resolved. Christopher Nolan has consistently preferred protagonists who succeed through intellect rather than overwhelming physical superiority. Batman defeats enemies through preparation. Cobb survives through psychological understanding. Oppenheimer transforms science rather than battlefields. Similarly, Odysseus repeatedly survives because of his intelligence, creativity, and adaptability. This emphasis creates more engaging dramatic tension because viewers cannot assume brute force will solve every problem. Yet the external journey is only half of the story. Perhaps the most important conflict in the Odyssey is internal. Odysseus is not simply attempting to return home physically. He must also preserve the person he once was. Years of warfare followed by years of wandering inevitably change him. Christopher Nolan has long been fascinated by characters questioning their own identities. Leonard Shelby struggles to define himself without reliable memory. Bruce Wayne balances public identity against personal trauma. Cooper sacrifices decades with his family for humanity's future. Oppenheimer confronts the consequences of his scientific achievements. Odysseus continues this tradition. Throughout the journey, he battles exhaustion, grief, loneliness, guilt, anger, pride, temptation, and despair. These emotional conflicts often prove more dangerous than monsters. The temptation offered by Calypso illustrates this perfectly. Unlike physical enemies attempting to kill him, Calypso offers peace, comfort, immortality, freedom from suffering. Objectively, these gifts appear desirable, yet accepting them would require abandoning his family, his responsibilities, and ultimately his identity. The conflict, therefore, becomes psychological rather than physical. What kind of man chooses endless comfort over difficult responsibility? Christopher Nolan repeatedly explores this question throughout his films. Characters are often tempted to escape painful realities. Some embrace illusion. Others confront truth despite enormous personal cost. Odysseus belongs firmly within the second category. Another recurring internal conflict involves pride. Odysseus is exceptionally intelligent, but his confidence frequently becomes arrogance. One of the most famous examples occurs after escaping the Cyclops. Rather than quietly celebrating survival, he reveals his true identity. One of the defining characteristics of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is that it avoids relying on a single traditional villain. Many modern blockbuster films build their narratives around one central antagonist whose defeat resolves the story. Homer's original epic follows a very different structure, and Nolan embraces that complexity. Instead of presenting one ultimate enemy, the film surrounds Odysseus with numerous antagonistic forces that challenge him physically, psychologically, morally, politically, and spiritually. Some enemies can be fought with swords. Others must be overcome through intelligence, patience, sacrifice, or self-control. Still others cannot be defeated at all and must simply be endured. This layered approach to antagonism makes the film considerably richer than a conventional hero versus villain story. Every major obstacle reveals something different about Odysseus, and every opposing force represents a different danger threatening not only his survival, but also his identity. By the end of the journey, audiences realize that the greatest enemy is not any individual creature or god, but the accumulation of trials that constantly tempt the hero to abandon hope. Perhaps the most powerful antagonistic force in the story is Poseidon. Unlike many cinematic villains who appear frequently on screen, Poseidon's influence is often indirect. His presence is felt through storms, shipwrecks, changing winds, impossible waves, and endless delays. This makes him particularly frightening because he represents a force that cannot simply be confronted in battle. Poseidon's anger begins after Odysseus blinds the Cyclops Polyphemus, who is his son. While Odysseus defeats the monster through intelligence rather than brute strength, his decision to reveal his true identity afterward becomes an act of pride. That single moment changes the course of the entire journey. Instead of escaping anonymously, Odysseus gives the Cyclops an opportunity to pray for divine revenge. Christopher Nolan reportedly emphasizes this sequence because it illustrates one of the film's central themes. Human beings often create their own greatest enemies. Poseidon's wrath does not emerge randomly. It grows directly from Odysseus' own mistake. This transforms divine punishment into something more psychologically interesting than simple revenge. Poseidon also symbolizes nature itself. Throughout history, the sea has represented both opportunity and destruction. Ancient civilizations depended on maritime trade, while simultaneously fearing storms capable of wiping out entire fleets. In the film, Poseidon becomes the embodiment of that unpredictable relationship between humanity and the natural world. Unlike physical villains who can be understood through dialogue or personal motivations, Poseidon feels almost elemental. He is less an individual personality than the overwhelming force of chaos itself. His anger shapes nearly every stage of Odysseus' journey, making him one of the film's most persistent antagonists despite relatively limited direct appearances. The Cyclops Polyphemus serves as one of the earliest and most memorable physical antagonists. His enormous size immediately establishes him as an overwhelming threat, but Christopher Nolan's interpretation reportedly extends far beyond visual spectacle. Polyphemus represents brute force without civilization. He ignores the sacred laws of hospitality that governed ancient Greek society. Rather than welcoming travelers as guests, he traps them inside his cave and consumes them as food. This shocking violation immediately identifies him as something more dangerous than a simple monster. In Homer's world, hospitality was not merely good manners. It was a sacred obligation protected by the gods themselves. By rejecting these customs, Polyphemus rejects the moral foundation of civilized society. His cave further reinforces this symbolism. Unlike the organized kingdoms visited elsewhere in the story, the Cyclops lives isolated from community, law, and cooperation. His world revolves entirely around personal strength. Odysseus ultimately defeats him not through superior power, but through superior intelligence. The famous deception involving the false name, Nobody, demonstrates the hero's greatest strength, strategy. However, Christopher Nolan reportedly ensures that this victory feels bittersweet. Although the Cyclops is defeated, Odysseus' pride afterward transforms triumph into long-term disaster. Thus, Polyphemus serves two narrative functions simultaneously. He is both an external enemy and the catalyst for future suffering. The Sirens represent an entirely different form of antagonism. Unlike monsters relying on violence, they attack the mind. Their greatest weapon is desire. Rather than forcing victims into submission, they invite them willingly toward destruction. This psychological approach aligns perfectly with Nolan's filmmaking style. Throughout his career, Nolan has frequently portrayed characters confronting illusions, memories, dreams, and emotional temptations. The Sirens become another expression of this fascination. They do not simply sing beautiful songs. They offer exactly what each listener most desperately wishes to hear. This makes them uniquely dangerous because defeating them requires extraordinary self-awareness. Odysseus understands his own vulnerability. Instead of pretending he cannot be tempted, he orders his companions to bind him tightly while blocking their own hearing. This remarkable decision illustrates one of Nolan's recurring ideas. True strength often comes from recognizing personal weakness rather than denying it. The Sirens therefore function less as monsters than as psychological tests. They force Odysseus to confront his own desires instead of physical enemies. Circe introduces another fascinating type of antagonist. Unlike many villains motivated by hatred, Circe exists within moral ambiguity. She possesses extraordinary power, yet remains emotionally complex. Her magical transformations challenge identity itself. Christopher Nolan has consistently explored characters questioning who they truly are. Circe extends this interest into mythological territory. Her ability to transform human beings into animals symbolizes the fragile boundary separating civilization from instinct. If identity can disappear so easily, what truly defines a person? Although Circe initially opposes Odysseus, their relationship reportedly evolves beyond simple conflict. She becomes one of several characters, forcing him to examine himself more honestly. One of the reasons the Odyssey has remained relevant for nearly 3,000 years is that it established many of the storytelling patterns that continue to influence literature, cinema, television, and video games today. Long before scholars such as Joseph Campbell developed the hero's journey framework or screenwriters began using the three-act structure and save the cat storytelling model, Homer's epic already demonstrated how a deeply personal journey could be combined with adventure, transformation, sacrifice, and emotional growth. Christopher Nolan's adaptation recognizes these timeless narrative foundations while presenting them through the language of modern cinema. Rather than forcing the story into a rigid formula, Nolan allows these storytelling structures to emerge naturally, showing why the Odyssey became one of the greatest inspirations for heroic storytelling throughout history. The hero's journey, popularized by mythologist Joseph Campbell in his book The Hero with 1,000 Faces, identifies recurring stages that appear in myths and legends from cultures around the world. These stages include the ordinary world, the call to adventure, crossing the threshold, trials and allies, the supreme ordeal, transformation, the return home, and the hero's final reward. While not every story follows these steps exactly, the Odyssey remains one of the clearest examples of this universal narrative pattern. Interestingly, Christopher Nolan begins the film after many of these early stages have already occurred. This reflects Homer's original structure, which famously starts in the middle of the larger story. The Trojan War has already ended. Odysseus has already accepted his call to adventure years earlier when he joined the Greek alliance against Troy. He has already crossed the first threshold by leaving Ithaca. Instead of watching the beginning of his heroic journey, audiences encounter a hero who has already been tested beyond imagination. This unusual narrative choice immediately distinguishes the Odyssey from many modern origin stories. Rather than watching an inexperienced individual gradually become a hero, viewers meet someone who has already earned legendary status, but now faces an even greater challenge: surviving the consequences of that heroism. The ordinary world in this story therefore exists primarily through memory. Ithaca represents the peaceful life Odysseus longs to recover. Throughout the film, home functions almost like a dream that becomes increasingly distant with every passing year. Christopher Nolan emphasizes this idea visually by contrasting the harsh environments of the journey with the emotional warmth associated with memories of Ithaca. The audience gradually understands that home is not simply a location, but an emotional state. It represents family, responsibility, identity, and belonging. Everything Odysseus endures gains meaning because of his desire to return to that ordinary world. Although the traditional call to adventure occurred years before the events of the film, Nolan effectively creates a new call. Instead of inviting Odysseus into war, the story asks whether he still possesses the strength to complete the journey home. After years of storms, monsters, and loss, continuing forward becomes a choice every bit as important as leaving Ithaca in the first place. This reframing transforms the hero's journey into something psychologically deeper. The greatest challenge is no longer beginning the adventure. It is refusing to abandon it after endless disappointment. One of the hero's journey's most recognizable stages involves crossing the threshold into an unfamiliar world. In the Odyssey, this threshold has expanded into an entire existence. Every island visited by Odysseus belongs to a realm where ordinary rules no longer seem reliable. Civilization gives way to mystery. Logic competes with mythology. Familiar customs disappear. Christopher Nolan presents each new location as a separate emotional threshold. Every environment forces Odysseus to adapt once again. He cannot rely on routine because every destination introduces different dangers, cultures, and expectations. This continual crossing of thresholds reinforces one of the film's major themes. Survival requires constant adaptation. The stage known as trials, allies, and enemies forms the largest section of both the hero's journey and the Odyssey itself. This is where the story demonstrates extraordinary complexity. Odysseus encounters countless trials. The Cyclops tests intelligence. The Sirens test discipline. Circe tests identity. Scylla and Charybdis test leadership. Calypso tests loyalty. Poseidon tests perseverance. The sea tests endurance. Time tests hope. Unlike many heroes who overcome increasingly powerful physical opponents, Odysseus confronts entirely different kinds of challenges. Some require courage. Others require restraint. Some reward cleverness. Others demand sacrifice. Christopher Nolan reportedly emphasizes this variety because it prevents the narrative from becoming repetitive. Every obstacle reveals a different aspect of the protagonist's personality. Allies also play crucial roles throughout the journey. Odysseus' companions provide loyalty, friendship, and practical assistance. Yet they also introduce responsibility. Their survival depends upon his leadership. Every mistake he makes affects not only himself, but everyone following him. This burden distinguishes him from solitary heroes. Leadership becomes one of the central lessons of the journey. True leaders accept responsibility even when circumstances become impossible. The gods themselves occupy unusual positions within the hero's journey. Some assist, others obstruct. Athena serves as a guiding presence whose wisdom repeatedly encourages Odysseus. Poseidon functions as relentless opposition. Rather than representing simple good versus evil, these divine forces symbolize competing influences shaping human destiny. Christopher Nolan frequently explores the relationship between individual choice and larger systems beyond human control. In the Odyssey, the gods become expressions of that ongoing tension. Perhaps the most significant stage of the hero's journey is the abyss or supreme ordeal. This represents the moment when the hero appears closest to failure. Everything previously learned is tested simultaneously. The hero must confront fear, loss, and uncertainty before genuine transformation becomes possible. In the Odyssey, this ordeal is not confined to one single event. One of the most anticipated aspects of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey was how the director would bring one of history's greatest mythological adventures to the screen while remaining faithful to his long-standing filmmaking philosophy. Modern audiences have become accustomed to fantasy films that rely heavily on computer-generated imagery, digital environments, virtual production, and motion capture technology. Massive franchises often create entire worlds inside computers, allowing filmmakers to depict impossible creatures, magical landscapes, and spectacular battles with almost limitless visual freedom. Christopher Nolan, however, has consistently taken a different approach throughout his career. While he embraces technological innovation, he strongly believes that visual effects should support storytelling rather than dominate it. His goal has always been to create experiences that feel physically real, allowing audiences to believe they are witnessing genuine events instead of digital simulations. The Odyssey represents perhaps the greatest technical challenge of Nolan's career because the source material demands encounters with giant monsters, divine beings, enchanted islands, supernatural storms, mythical creatures, and impossible natural phenomena. Completely avoiding visual effects would have been impossible. Instead, Nolan reportedly sought a balance between practical filmmaking and carefully controlled digital enhancement, creating a world where fantasy feels grounded in reality. This philosophy has defined Christopher Nolan's work for more than 2 decades. Rather than asking what computers can create, he first asks what can actually be built, filmed, or captured in front of the camera. Real locations, physical sets, practical stunts, detailed miniatures, authentic lighting, and in-camera effects remain the foundation of his filmmaking process. Digital technology is then used to enhance what already exists rather than replacing it entirely. One of the most important technological decisions behind the Odyssey was the continued use of large-format IMAX cameras. Nolan has become one of the strongest advocates for IMAX photography because of the incredible image quality it provides. These cameras capture extraordinary levels of detail, allowing landscapes, faces, costumes, and environments to appear more immersive than traditional digital formats. For a story built around vast oceans, towering cliffs, ancient cities, and expansive coastlines, IMAX photography becomes more than a technical choice. It becomes a storytelling tool. The immense scale of the frame allows audiences to appreciate the loneliness of Odysseus' journey. A single ship crossing an endless sea immediately communicates isolation in a way that smaller visual formats cannot. Christopher Nolan has often explained that image quality directly influences emotional engagement. When viewers believe they're seeing genuine environments, they connect more deeply with the characters inhabiting those spaces. The Odyssey benefits enormously from this philosophy because its world depends upon audiences accepting ancient Greece as a believable civilization rather than a digital fantasy. Real-world locations reportedly formed another essential component of the production. Instead of constructing every environment inside a studio using green screens, Nolan chose to film across coastal landscapes, rocky islands, mountain regions, caves, and historical environments that naturally resemble the Mediterranean world described by Homer. Natural light plays a particularly important role in this approach. Sunlight reflecting across the sea, storms forming over distant horizons, morning mist surrounding cliffs, and golden evening light illuminating ancient stone all create visual authenticity that remains extremely difficult to reproduce digitally. Filming in actual locations also affect performances. Actors standing on genuine ships surrounded by real waves naturally respond differently than performers working inside green screen studios. Wind, water, uneven terrain, and changing weather become part of the acting process rather than obstacles removed through technology. This commitment to physical filmmaking extends to production design. Large practical sets reportedly recreated palaces, temples, ports, villages, caves, and royal halls using traditional construction methods. Rather than relying entirely on computer-generated architecture, the production team built detailed environments that actors could physically inhabit. These practical environments contribute subtle visual details impossible to fake convincingly. Stone reflects light differently than digital textures. Wood ages naturally. Dust accumulates realistically. Water behaves unpredictably. Small imperfections make environments feel genuinely lived in. Christopher Nolan has repeatedly argued that audiences unconsciously recognize these differences even if they cannot consciously explain them. One of the greatest technical challenges involved recreating ancient ships. The Odyssey revolves around maritime travel. Ships function almost like secondary characters throughout the story. Their construction, movement, and gradual deterioration communicate years of hardship. Rather than relying exclusively on digital vessels, the production reportedly built full-scale ships inspired by historical research into Bronze Age naval design. These practical ships allowed actors to interact naturally with ropes, sails, wooden decks, and changing weather conditions. Ocean filming has always presented enormous logistical challenges. Unlike controlled studio environments, the sea constantly changes. Lighting shifts unexpectedly. Waves alter movement. Wind affects equipment. Weather delays production. Christopher Nolan reportedly embraced many of these difficulties because they contribute authenticity impossible to manufacture digitally. When audiences see actors genuinely struggling against powerful waves or violent winds, the emotional impact becomes significantly stronger. Visual effects artists then enhanced rather than replaced these practical elements. Computer-generated imagery remains essential throughout the Odyssey, particularly when depicting mythological creatures. The Cyclops represents one of the largest visual effects achievements in the film. Rather than appearing as a completely digital creation lacking physical presence, the production reportedly combined practical reference models, detailed creature design, performance capture techniques, and carefully integrated CGI. The greatest achievement of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is not its visual spectacle, historical authenticity, or technical innovation. Although the film contains breathtaking landscapes, mythological creatures, large-scale action, and ambitious filmmaking, its lasting power comes from something much deeper. At its heart, The Odyssey is an emotional story about endurance, love, family, identity, loss, and the hope that no matter how impossible the journey may seem, home is still worth fighting for. This emotional foundation transforms what could have been a conventional fantasy adventure into a deeply human experience that resonates long after the credits begin to roll. Christopher Nolan has often been described as an intellectual filmmaker. His movies challenge audiences with complex narratives, philosophical questions, and unconventional storytelling structures. However, one of the biggest misconceptions about his work is that it values ideas more than emotion. In reality, nearly every Nolan film is built around a powerful emotional core. Interstellar is fundamentally about the bond between a father and daughter. The Prestige explores obsession and sacrifice. Inception examines guilt, grief, and the struggle to let go. Oppenheimer studies the psychological burden of responsibility. The Odyssey continues this tradition by placing human emotion at the center of an ancient myth. Rather than asking audiences to admire Odysseus because he defeats monsters, Nolan encourages them to understand why he refuses to stop fighting. Every danger becomes emotionally meaningful because viewers understand what waits for him at the end of the journey. One of the strongest emotional themes throughout the film is longing. Longing is a feeling almost everyone has experienced. It is the desire to return to a place, reconnect with a loved one, recover something that has been lost, or become the person we once were. Odysseus spends 20 years separated from his family. Every storm that pushes his ship away from Ithaca deepens this longing. Every island delays the reunion. Every victory still leaves him far from home. Christopher Nolan reportedly emphasizes this emotional distance far more than simple physical distance. The audience gradually realizes that the greatest pain is not the dangerous journey itself. It is knowing that the people waiting at home continue living without him. This emotional tension affects every major character. Penelope experiences longing differently. She remains physically at home while emotionally existing in a state of permanent uncertainty. Every day presents the same impossible question. Should she continue believing her husband is alive? Or should she finally accept that he will never return? Nolan reportedly portrays this uncertainty with remarkable restraint. Rather than expressing constant grief through dramatic speeches, Penelope communicates emotion through quiet determination. Small moments become enormously powerful. A glance toward the sea, a familiar object reminding her of Odysseus. Silence during conversations about the future. These understated emotional choices reflect Nolan's directing style. He often trusts audiences to recognize emotion through behavior rather than explanation. Telemachus contributes another deeply emotional perspective. Unlike his mother, he barely remembers his father. His entire identity has developed around stories told by others. This creates a unique form of loneliness. He misses someone he cannot fully remember. He feels pressure to become like a father whose achievements seem almost impossible to equal. Many viewers connect strongly with Telemachus because his conflict reflects universal questions about identity. Who are we without the people who shaped us? How do we honor those we admire while becoming ourselves? Christopher Nolan allows Telemachus to grow gradually throughout the film. His emotional journey becomes one of self-discovery rather than simple hero worship. Another major emotional strength of the film comes from its treatment of time. Most adventure stories move quickly from one exciting event to another. The Odyssey repeatedly reminds audiences that years are passing. Children become adults. Parents grow older. Kingdoms change. Memories fade. Time itself becomes one of the story's greatest emotional forces. Christopher Nolan has always been fascinated by time. Interstellar explores decades passing within hours. Dunkirk presents different timelines simultaneously. Memento examines memory's relationship with time. Tenet plays with time itself as a physical concept. The Odyssey approaches time emotionally. Instead of asking how time works, Nolan asks what time does to people. The answer is often heartbreaking. Odysseus loses moments that can never be recovered. He misses birthdays, family celebrations, conversations, the ordinary experiences that quietly define a lifetime. When audiences realize everything he has sacrificed simply by being absent, the emotional weight of his journey increases enormously. One of the film's most powerful emotional sequences reportedly involves Odysseus remembering Ithaca. These moments avoid excessive sentimentality. Instead, brief memories interrupt his dangerous travels. Simple images carry extraordinary emotional power. The sound of laughter, a familiar room, sunlight across the palace, his wife, his son. These memories become emotional anchors, preventing despair from overwhelming him. Christopher Nolan frequently uses memory as a storytelling device. In Memento, memory defines identity. In Inception, memory shapes dreams. In the Odyssey, memory becomes survival. Without memories of home, the journey loses purpose. Another source of emotional impact comes from loss. The Odyssey does not present adventure as glamorous. Every success carries consequences. Companions die. Ships sink. Friendships end. Years disappear forever. Unlike many action films where supporting characters exist primarily to increase spectacle, Nolan reportedly ensures that every loss carries emotional significance. Odysseus remembers those who do not survive. Their absence affects future decisions. The audience therefore experiences grief alongside the protagonist rather than quickly moving to the next adventure. This emotional continuity strengthens the realism of the story. People do not simply recover immediately from tragedy. Neither does Odysseus. Christopher Nolan consistently portrays trauma as something that remains with characters rather than disappearing after dramatic scenes conclude. Adapting the Odyssey for modern cinema is one of the most difficult challenges any filmmaker can undertake. Unlike adapting a contemporary novel, a modern screenplay, or even a recent historical account, Christopher Nolan was working with one of the oldest surviving works of literature in human history. Homer's The Odyssey has existed for nearly 3,000 years, influencing countless books, plays, films, television series, poems, and works of art. It is not simply a famous story. It is one of the foundations upon which Western storytelling itself was built. Every adaptation, therefore, carries enormous responsibility. It must respect the original work while also speaking to audiences who live in a completely different cultural, historical, and philosophical world. Christopher Nolan approached this challenge with a philosophy that has remained consistent throughout his career. Rather than creating a scene-by-scene recreation of the source material, he sought to preserve its emotional and thematic essence while reshaping certain elements for the language of modern cinema. His adaptation, therefore, remains faithful to Homer's central ideas even when individual scenes, character relationships, narrative structure, and visual presentation differ from the ancient poem. Perhaps the most significant challenge facing any adaptation of the Odyssey is its structure. Modern audiences generally expect films to follow a relatively straightforward dramatic progression. Stories often introduce characters, establish goals, present escalating conflicts, and conclude with a satisfying resolution. Homer's original poem works differently. The Odyssey famously begins in the middle of the larger story. Odysseus has already spent years wandering after the Trojan War. His adventures have already begun. The audience learns about many earlier events only through flashbacks and conversations. This narrative technique, known as in medias res, was remarkably sophisticated for its time and continues to influence storytelling today. Christopher Nolan has always been attracted to unconventional narrative structures. Memento tells its story in reverse. Inception layers multiple realities simultaneously. Dunkirk unfolds across 3 interconnected timelines. Oppenheimer alternates between different periods of the scientist's life. Because of this, Nolan was perhaps uniquely qualified to preserve Homer's nonlinear storytelling instead of simplifying it into chronological order. Rather than viewing the original structure as outdated, Nolan recognized it as one of the poem's greatest strengths. Beginning in the middle immediately creates mystery. Who is Odysseus? Why has he not returned? What happened after Troy? These unanswered questions encourage audiences to participate actively in assembling the story. Another major adaptation decision involves characterization. In Homer's poem, Odysseus is already one of Greece's greatest heroes. He is admired for intelligence, courage, leadership, and extraordinary resilience. However, ancient heroic ideals differ significantly from modern expectations. Ancient audiences often admire qualities such as military glory, personal honor, cunning, and public reputation above emotional vulnerability. Modern audiences generally expect more psychological complexity. Christopher Nolan expands Odysseus' emotional life considerably while remaining faithful to his essential personality. The film explores loneliness, trauma, self-doubt, grief, guilt, exhaustion. These emotions certainly exist within Homer's poem, but Nolan brings them to the forefront through cinematic storytelling. Rather than reducing Odysseus to an invincible warrior, the adaptation presents him as a profoundly human individual carrying extraordinary emotional burdens. This approach aligns with Nolan's broader filmmaking philosophy. His protagonists rarely function as flawless heroes. Bruce Wayne struggles with fear. Cobb battles guilt. Cooper sacrifices family. Oppenheimer questions the consequences of scientific achievement. Odysseus joins this tradition as another deeply complicated central character. Penelope receives one of the most significant expansions compared to the original source. In Homer's poem, she is already portrayed as remarkably intelligent and loyal. Her famous weaving strategy allows her to delay choosing a new husband while preserving hope that Odysseus may still return. Christopher Nolan builds upon these qualities by giving her greater political and emotional agency. Rather than simply waiting, Penelope actively preserves Ithaca's stability. She negotiates with powerful nobles, protects Telemachus, maintains royal authority despite overwhelming pressure. This adaptation reflects contemporary interest in presenting female characters as active participants in the narrative rather than passive symbols. Importantly, Nolan accomplishes this without contradicting Homer's original characterization. Instead, he develops qualities already present within the source material. Telemachus also receives greater narrative emphasis. The original poem devotes considerable attention to his journey toward adulthood. Modern adaptations have sometimes reduced this storyline to focus more heavily on Odysseus. Nolan reportedly restores much of its importance. Telemachus becomes more than the hero's son. He develops his own emotional arc involving identity, leadership, confidence, and responsibility. This parallel journey strengthens the family dimension of a narrative while giving younger audiences another character through whom they can experience the story. One of the most interesting adaptation decisions concerns the gods. In Homer's world, divine intervention forms an ordinary part of reality. Athena appears directly. Poseidon actively punishes Odysseus. Hermes delivers messages. Ancient audiences accepted these interactions naturally because mythology shaped their understanding of the world. Modern audiences approach such material differently. Some expect literal fantasy. Others prefer symbolic interpretation. Christopher Nolan reportedly embraces ambiguity. Rather than fully explaining every supernatural event, the film allows multiple interpretations. Viewers may understand the gods as literal beings influencing human destiny. Others may interpret them psychologically or symbolically. Athena becomes wisdom. Poseidon becomes uncontrollable nature. The gods become expressions of forces larger than individual human experience. This ambiguity respects both ancient mythology and modern philosophical diversity. One of the defining characteristics of Christopher Nolan's filmmaking is that his movies reward repeat viewings. While casual audiences can enjoy the surface-level narrative, attentive viewers often discover additional layers hidden beneath the main story. Small visual details, carefully placed dialogue, symbolic imagery, recurring motifs, historical references, mythological connections, and subtle foreshadowing gradually reveal themselves over multiple viewings. Films such as Memento, The Prestige, Inception, Interstellar, Dunkirk, Tenet, and Oppenheimer all contain countless details that become meaningful only after the audience already knows the ending. The Odyssey continues this tradition on an even larger scale, because Homer's original epic already contains centuries of symbolism and literary meaning. Christopher Nolan reportedly embraces this complexity, filling the film with references that reward viewers who pay close attention while never distracting those simply enjoying the adventure. Perhaps the most obvious layer of hidden detail involves Homer's original text itself. Throughout the film, numerous scenes mirror famous passages from the ancient poem without recreating them word for word. A line of dialogue may subtly echo an ancient verse. A camera angle may resemble classical artwork depicting the same event. A piece of music may accompany a moment described thousands of years ago. These references function almost like conversations between the film and its literary source. Viewers familiar with the original poem recognize these moments immediately, while newcomers simply experience them as natural parts of the narrative. Christopher Nolan has consistently demonstrated respect for audiences by refusing to explain every reference directly. Instead, he trusts viewers to discover connections over time. Another fascinating layer of hidden detail appears through recurring visual motifs. Water becomes one of the film's most important symbolic elements. On the surface, the sea represents the physical obstacle separating Odysseus from home. However, Nolan repeatedly uses water to communicate emotional states. Calm seas often accompany moments of reflection. Violent storms mirror emotional turmoil. Still water reflects memory. Dark water symbolizes uncertainty. The audience gradually realizes that the ocean functions almost like an emotional landscape rather than simply a geographical setting. This symbolic use of nature has appeared throughout Nolan's career. In Interstellar, space reflects both isolation and hope. In Dunkirk, the sea represents survival and entrapment simultaneously. In the Odyssey, water becomes a constantly evolving emotional language. Fire forms another recurring symbol. Ancient civilizations depended upon fire for warmth, protection, cooking, communication, and ritual. Throughout the film, Christopher Nolan reportedly uses fire to represent civilization itself. Whenever Odysseus encounters safe communities, fire appears welcoming. Torches illuminate temples. Families gather around hearths. Signal fires suggest communication. In hostile environments, however, fire changes meaning. Burning ships symbolize destruction. Wild flames suggest chaos. Funeral fires represent remembrance. These repeated visual associations quietly reinforce emotional themes without requiring explicit explanation. The stars also receive remarkable attention. Ancient sailors relied upon celestial navigation long before modern technology existed. Throughout the journey, Odysseus repeatedly looks toward familiar constellations. Initially, audiences may assume these moments simply establish realism. However, repeated viewings reveal deeper significance. The stars remain unchanged while everything else constantly changes. Friends disappear. Kingdoms evolve. Ships sink. Years pass. Yet the night sky remains constant. Christopher Nolan uses this continuity to symbolize hope and permanence. No matter how lost Odysseus becomes, the stars continue pointing toward home. One of the film's most subtle recurring details involves doors and thresholds. Characters repeatedly pass through gates, palace entrances, cave openings, temple doorways, and narrow passages. These transitions quietly reinforce one of the story's central ideas. Every threshold represents transformation. Crossing into the Cyclops cave changes the journey. Leaving Calypso's island changes Odysseus emotionally. Returning to Ithaca requires crossing another symbolic threshold. Christopher Nolan frequently uses architecture to express psychological states. The repeated emphasis on entrances and exits therefore functions as visual storytelling rather than random composition. Another fascinating hidden detail concerns costume evolution. Rather than maintaining identical heroic appearances throughout the film, Odysseus' clothing reportedly changes gradually over the course of 20 years. Armor disappears. Royal garments deteriorate. Repairs become visible. Colors fade. Materials weather naturally. By the conclusion, audiences realize they have unconsciously watched time reshape the protagonist physically. Nothing dramatic announces these changes. Instead, costume design quietly communicates years of hardship. Penelope's clothing also evolves subtly. Although she remains within Ithaca, changing fabrics, colors, and construction reflect both political circumstances and emotional development. These details become especially noticeable during repeat viewings. Christopher Nolan has always valued practical storytelling through visual design rather than exposition. Mirrors and reflections appear throughout the film in surprisingly meaningful ways. Sometimes characters literally observe themselves in water. Other times, polished bronze, shields, or palace decorations create reflections. These moments rarely last long. Yet collectively, they reinforce recurring questions about identity. Who has Odysseus become? Does he still recognize himself? Can 20 years of suffering leave a person unchanged? Reflections visually suggest these psychological concerns without requiring dialogue. One particularly clever example of foreshadowing reportedly occurs during the early portions of the film. Objects associated with home repeatedly appear before audiences fully understand their significance. A weaving pattern, an olive tree, a familiar ring, a carved chair. Initially, these details seem like ordinary environmental decoration. The spinning top in Inception, the notebook in Memento, the hats in The Prestige. Similarly, everyday objects within the Odyssey gradually accumulate symbolic meaning. Sound design contains numerous hidden details as well. Christopher Nolan often layers subtle audio beneath dialogue. The Odyssey reportedly continues this practice. Distant waves remain audible even during scenes far from the sea. Certain musical themes return whenever home is mentioned. Specific instruments accompany memories of Ithaca. Attentive listeners notice recurring sound patterns connecting scenes separated by many years within the narrative. These audio callbacks operate almost subconsciously, strengthening emotional continuity. Another remarkable layer involves mythological symbolism. Each mythical creature represents more than physical danger. The Cyclops embodies unchecked strength without wisdom. The Sirens symbolize destructive desire. Circe represents transformation and identity. Scylla and Charybdis reflect impossible choices. Calypso embodies comfortable surrender. Poseidon represents forces beyond human control. Christopher Nolan emphasizes these symbolic dimensions through visual storytelling. Each encounter resembles an internal psychological struggle as much as an external adventure. Viewers recognizing these symbolic meanings often discover entirely new interpretations during subsequent viewings. Architectural design also contains numerous historical references. Many palace layouts, temple decorations, columns, frescoes, and ceremonial spaces reportedly draw inspiration from archaeological discoveries connected to Mycenaean civilization. These details may escape casual viewers entirely. However, historians and archaeology enthusiasts recognize careful references to real Bronze Age cultures. Christopher Nolan reportedly avoided generic fantasy architecture in favor of historically informed design whenever possible. This historical authenticity rewards audiences familiar with ancient Mediterranean history. The film also contains numerous references to Christopher Nolan's previous works. While never distracting from the story, attentive viewers may notice familiar visual techniques. Characters standing alone within enormous landscapes recall Interstellar. Complex practical effects resemble Dunkirk. Questions about identity echo Memento. Dreamlike transitions recall Inception. Discussions of responsibility parallel Oppenheimer. These similarities are not direct references, but rather thematic continuations connecting the Odyssey with Nolan's larger body of work. Longtime fans therefore experience additional enjoyment, recognizing recurring artistic interests. Color symbolism becomes increasingly noticeable after repeated viewings. Warm golden tones frequently accompany memories, family, and civilization. Cool blue and gray palettes dominate isolation at sea. Green environments often introduce temptation or uncertainty. Dark shadows accompany moral ambiguity. These gradual color transitions influence emotional responses even when audiences remain unaware of them consciously. Christopher Nolan's cinematography consistently employs color psychologically rather than decoratively. Another hidden detail involves the passage of time itself. Instead of repeatedly displaying titles announcing passing years, Nolan allows small environmental changes to communicate time naturally. Children grow older, buildings weather, ships deteriorate, hair length changes, seasonal vegetation evolves. The audience slowly realizes just how much time has disappeared without requiring explicit reminders. This subtle approach strengthens emotional realism. Perhaps one of the most rewarding discoveries concerns Penelope's weaving. Ancient audiences immediately understood the symbolism of weaving because textile production occupied a central place within Greek domestic life. Christopher Nolan expands this symbolism visually. The weaving becomes more than a practical task. It represents patience, memory, resistance, hope. Every thread symbolizes another day of faith. Every undone section represents refusal to surrender. Viewers recognizing this symbolism often discover additional emotional depth within seemingly quiet domestic scenes. Dialogue also contains numerous carefully hidden references. Certain phrases subtly echo Homeric poetry. Others foreshadow future decisions. Some possess double meanings only understood after later events unfold. Christopher Nolan has consistently enjoyed writing dialogue that changes meaning once audiences possess additional information. The Odyssey reportedly continues this technique throughout the screenplay. Simple conversations become remarkably rich upon second viewing. Another fascinating detail involves camera composition. Christopher Nolan frequently positions characters differently depending upon emotional relationships. Separated family members often appear isolated within large frames. Moments of reunion gradually reduce physical distance. Power struggles influence vertical positioning. Characters facing moral uncertainty frequently appear framed between opposing visual elements. These compositional choices quietly reinforce emotional dynamics without requiring conscious audience awareness. The final act reportedly contains numerous visual callbacks to earlier scenes. Locations resemble previous memories. Camera angles repeat from completely different emotional contexts. Musical themes return transformed. Objects introduced early reappear with entirely new significance. Christopher Nolan has always enjoyed circular storytelling where endings reshape audiences' understanding of beginnings. The Odyssey uses these callbacks to reinforce the emotional completion of Odysseus' journey. Perhaps the deepest layer of hidden meaning involves the relationship between mythology and psychology. Every monster can be interpreted literally. Every monster can also represent an internal struggle. Poseidon becomes uncontrollable fate. The Cyclops becomes arrogance. The Sirens become temptation. Circe becomes identity. Calypso becomes surrender. The audience never needs to choose one interpretation exclusively. Christopher Nolan deliberately preserves both possibilities simultaneously. This philosophical openness encourages endless discussion among viewers. One reason the film has inspired so much analysis is that almost every scene operates on multiple levels. A beautiful landscape may simultaneously function as historical reconstruction, emotional symbolism, mythological reference, and character development.